Naomi Jenkins was thrown out of the luxury hotel her husband had just purchased, without the staff realizing she was the new owner's wife. The moment she crossed the threshold, Naomi experienced something far worse than she anticipated. Blatant racism from the hotel's manager. What was supposed to be a celebration turned into an unforgettable confrontation that would soon change the hotel's atmosphere forever. When the truth came to light, the consequences would be felt by everyone involved. Before we start, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit subscribe. There's a new and heartwarming tale waiting for you tomorrow. Naomi stepped into the grand lobby of Regal Heights Hotel, excited to celebrate her husband Jonathan's latest business venture. The hotel had recently become part of their growing empire, and tonight was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter for them. The opulence of the space was undeniable. The chandeliers sparkled above her, and the polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of the lighting. But beneath the surface, there was something far less welcoming. Naomi, dressed in a sleek, tailored dress, approached the reception desk with confidence. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, and she smiled warmly at the hotel's manager, a man named Richard. But her smile was met with a cold, detached stare. His eyes swept over her, taking in her appearance with the faintest hint of disdain. "Good evening," Naomi greeted him politely. "I have a reservation. My husband was already inside." Richard barely glanced at the computer screen before he began typing. His fingers moved quickly, but his disinterest was palpable. After a few seconds, he looked up at her and shook his head. "I'm not seeing any reservation for you," he said flatly, his tone dismissive. Naomi blinked, momentarily taken aback. She had been to plenty of luxury hotels and never encountered such immediate resistance. She maintained her composure. "My husband's name is Jonathan Jenkins. Could you check under his name?" Richard's expression didn't change. He typed a few more keys, then shook his head again. "We don't have anything under that name either," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "We're fully booked tonight. You'll need to leave." Naomi felt a surge of disbelief wash over her. The tone, the coldness, the refusal, it all added up to something unmistakable. This wasn't just a mistake with the reservation. Richard wasn't interested in helping her because he didn't think she belonged there. Naomi had experienced moments like this before. Subtle racism, dismissive glances, people underestimating her based on her appearance, but this was different. This was her husband's hotel. They owned this place, and yet here she was being told to leave as if she didn't matter. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it break her composure. "I see," Naomi said calmly, her voice steady though her heart was racing. "I'll step outside and call my husband. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." Richard gave her a curt nod, his gaze already shifting away from her, as if he were eager to be rid of her. Naomi turned and walked toward the exit, her mind swirling with disbelief. As she left the lobby, she could feel the eyes of other guests on her, some curious, some judgmental. It was a feeling she knew all too well, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Once outside, Naomi took a deep breath. She pulled out her phone and dialed Jonathan's number, her fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. They were supposed to be celebrating, enjoying the success they had worked so hard for. But now it felt like something far more important was at stake. Jonathan picked up after a couple of rings. "Naomi, where are you? I thought you'd be inside by now." "I'm outside," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I had a situation at the front desk." "What kind of situation?" Jonathan's tone immediately sharpened with concern. "The manager," Naomi began, "he told me there wasn't a reservation for us, and then he asked me to leave." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Naomi could almost hear Jonathan's mind racing as he processed what she had just told him. "I'll be right there," Jonathan said firmly. "Wait for me outside. I'll handle this." Naomi nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay," she said softly. As she ended the call, she stood there for a moment, staring at the grand entrance of the hotel. She had a feeling that tonight would be about more than just dinner. It would be about confronting something much deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. She just didn't realize how far-reaching the consequences would be. Jonathan Jenkins strode through the lobby of Regal Heights Hotel with a purpose, his eyes scanning the grand space for any sign of his wife. His steps were quick, his face set with determination, but beneath the surface, there was a storm brewing. Naomi had called him just minutes ago, but the sting of her words still echoed in his mind. His wife, his partner, had been asked to leave his own hotel. The absurdity of the situation only fueled his anger. As he made his way to the reception desk, His tall frame and commanding presence immediately caught the attention of the staff. Richard, the manager, looked up and instantly recognized the man approaching him. Jonathan was not just another guest. He was the owner, the man whose name was now tied to the fate of the hotel. But Richard's confidence faltered for only a second before he straightened his posture, adopting the professional demeanor he always wore when dealing with important clients. "Mr. Jenkins, good evening," Richard greeted, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Jonathan's gaze remained hard as he stared down at Richard. "Yes, actually. You can explain to me why my wife was told to leave." The air between them grew tense. Richard's smile faltered, and he blinked, momentarily thrown off by the bluntness of the question. "Your wife?" he echoed, clearly caught off guard. Jonathan crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. "Yes, my wife, Naomi Jenkins. She called me not 5 minutes ago to tell me that she was turned away at the front desk. You told her there was no reservation." Richard's face drained of color as the realization hit him. Naomi, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought. I wasn't aware that she was your wife," Richard stammered, his confidence rapidly crumbling. "There must have been a mix-up." "A mix-up?" Jonathan repeated, his voice cold. "Is that what you call it? You didn't even bother to check the reservation properly, did you?" Richard opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. He knew there was no point in arguing. Jonathan's piercing gaze left him with no room for excuses. I didn't realize," Richard muttered, the weight of his mistake finally sinking in. "It shouldn't matter if you knew who she was," Jonathan said, his tone sharp. "That's not how you treat any guest, much less my wife. We own this hotel, and yet you had the nerve to dismiss her because you didn't think she belonged here." The lobby, which had been buzzing with activity moments ago, seemed to quiet as the conversation between the two men intensified. Staff members and guests alike couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Richard, for the first time, felt truly exposed. His usual confidence, the air of authority he carried so easily, had evaporated under the weight of Jonathan's words. Jonathan's voice grew even more measured, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "I've heard whispers about the way things are run here. I didn't want to believe it, but now I see it for myself. Is this how you treat all of our guests? Turning people away because they don't fit your image of who should be here?" Richard remained silent, his eyes dropping to the floor. There was no denying what had happened, and there was no way to undo it. The damage had been done, and now all he could do was brace himself for the consequences. Jonathan, his patience wearing thin, gave a final pointed look at Richard before turning away. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice softening just slightly. "Where is my wife?" Richard gestured toward the front entrance, his voice small and subdued. "She's outside, sir." Without another word, Jonathan made his way toward the door, his jaw tight. He pushed through the glass doors and stepped out into the cool evening air, his eyes immediately finding Naomi standing near the entrance, her phone still in her hand. She looked up as he approached, relief and frustration mingling on her face. "I'm so sorry, Naomi," Jonathan said quietly as he reached her. "I had no idea this would happen." Naomi shook her head, offering him a sad smile. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "But it does need to be addressed. We can't let this slide." Jonathan nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "You're right. This won't go unanswered." As they stood there side by side, the reality of what had just occurred set in. What was supposed to be a joyous evening had turned into something much darker. But Naomi and Jonathan both knew that this moment, however painful, would spark the changes that needed to happen within the hotel. Jonathan took a deep breath, his hand resting gently on Naomi's back as they re-entered the hotel together. Whatever came next, they would face it as a team. Jonathan and Naomi walked back into the lobby together, the atmosphere noticeably tense. As they crossed the threshold, Naomi glanced around at the grand decor that now felt cold and distant. This place was supposed to represent a new chapter for them, a place where luxury met inclusivity, where all guests could feel welcome. But tonight, the hotel's true culture had been revealed, and it wasn't what they had envisioned. Richard was still standing by the reception desk, looking as though he were bracing for a storm. His once confident demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He hadn't expected to be called out, especially not by the owner himself, and now he was scrambling to salvage whatever he could of his reputation. Jonathan approached the desk again, but this time, his wife by his side, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Naomi's presence was a powerful reminder of the gravity of Richard's mistake. "Richard," Jonathan began, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "I think it's time we had a more serious conversation About what just happened. Richard swallowed hard, nodding slowly. Yes, sir, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But before Jonathan could say another word, the hotel's senior manager, Gregory, hurried over, clearly sensing the growing tension. Gregory had been with the hotel for years and had a reputation for being diligent and level-headed, but even he seemed uneasy at the sight of Jonathan and Naomi standing together in front of the now shaken Richard. Mr. Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins, Gregory began, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. I've just been informed about the situation, and I want to personally apologize on behalf of the hotel. This is absolutely not how we conduct business here. Jonathan glanced at Gregory, his eyes narrowing. Isn't it, though? He asked pointedly. Because from what I've seen, this isn't an isolated incident. My wife was turned away because your manager decided she didn't fit the image of the kind of guest he wants in this hotel. Gregory's face paled slightly. Sir, I assure you this is not reflective of our policies. Jonathan cut him off. Policies are one thing, but behavior is another. And right now, the behavior I've witnessed suggests there's a deeper issue here. Naomi, standing beside Jonathan, spoke up, her voice calm but resolute. I've worked in spaces like this before. I know what it feels like to walk into a place and immediately be judged because of how I look. This isn't new to me, but I didn't expect it here, at a place we now own. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Gregory shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Richard, standing off to the side, looked as though he wished he could disappear into the floor. Jonathan's expression remained firm. We bought this hotel because we believed in its potential. We believed it could be more than just another luxury establishment, that it could be a place where everyone, no matter their background, could feel welcome. But if this is the way your staff treats people, then we have a serious problem. Gregory nodded quickly, his face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. You're absolutely right, Mr. Jenkins. This is unacceptable, and I will personally ensure that Richard is dealt with accordingly. Jonathan didn't react immediately, his eyes still locked on Gregory's. It's not just about Richard, he said after a moment. This isn't just one person's failure. It's a cultural issue, and it needs to change. Gregory's face flushed slightly, and he nodded again, more emphatically this time. Understood, sir. We will make the necessary changes, starting immediately. Naomi, still standing quietly beside Jonathan, felt a mix of emotions. The confrontation was necessary, but it was draining. She hadn't wanted to spend the evening fighting for her dignity in a place that was supposed to feel like a second home. But she knew that if nothing changed, it wouldn't just be her who suffered. It would be every guest who was made to feel like they didn't belong. Jonathan took a deep breath and nodded. Good, he said, his tone softening slightly. But I'll be overseeing these changes personally. I expect a full report on how this is going to be handled, and I want bias training implemented for the entire staff, effective immediately. Gregory quickly agreed, promising to send a detailed plan by the following day. Richard, meanwhile, remained silent, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. He knew his time as the hotel's manager might be over, or at the very least, severely diminished. Jonathan turned to Naomi and gave her a small, reassuring smile. Let's go have dinner, he said quietly, offering her his arm. We'll deal with the rest of this tomorrow. Naomi nodded, grateful for his calm in the midst of the storm. Together, they walked toward the restaurant, leaving behind the tension that still lingered at the reception desk. Though the evening hadn't gone as planned, Naomi knew that the events of the night were the start of something much bigger. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure the hotel lived up to its potential as a place of true inclusivity. And she was ready to be part of that change. As Naomi and Jonathan sat down in the restaurant, the mood between them remained subdued. The elegant ambiance of the dining room, with its soft lighting and beautifully set tables, did little to ease the tension that lingered from the confrontation they had just endured. The staff here was polite, even overly accommodating, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong in the hotel's culture. The waiter approached, all smiles and charm, handing them the menus. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, he said warmly. It's a pleasure to have you dining with us tonight. Can I start you off with something to drink? Jonathan gave the waiter a polite nod, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Just water for now, he said, glancing at Naomi for confirmation. She nodded silently, her eyes scanning the room, her thoughts still on the events at the front desk. Once the waiter had stepped away, Jonathan turned to her, his expression softening. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, he said quietly. I never thought something like that would happen here, especially not at one of our hotels. Naomi sighed, her hands resting on the table as she gathered her thoughts. It's not your fault, Jonathan, she said gently, but it's a sign that we have a bigger problem to deal with. The way Richard treated me, it wasn't just about a reservation. It was about how he saw me, how he saw people who look like me. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tightening. I know, and we're going to fix it. We can't let this continue, not if we want this hotel to succeed. Naomi's gaze softened as she looked at her husband. She knew he was committed to making things right, but the weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. It wasn't just about correcting Richard's behavior. It was about changing the entire culture of the hotel, making sure that this kind of discrimination didn't happen to anyone else. I just don't want this place to turn into another story about luxury being exclusive, Naomi said, her voice thoughtful. There's enough of that in the world already. We have a chance to do something different here, to create a space where everyone feels welcome, no matter who they are or where they come from. Jonathan reached across the table and took her hand, his expression full of resolve. That's exactly what we're going to do, he said firmly. This hotel is going to be a place where people are treated with respect, where no one is turned away because of who they are. And it starts with us. Naomi smiled faintly, appreciating the determination in his voice, but she knew that change wouldn't come easily. The hotel had a history, a reputation, and deep-rooted biases that wouldn't be dismantled overnight. Still, she was ready to be part of the solution, even if it meant taking on more of an active role than she had originally planned. As they continued their meal, the conversation shifted to more practical matters. Jonathan laid out his plan for the coming days: meetings with the senior staff, a thorough review of the hotel's policies, and immediate implementation of bias training for all employees. Naomi listened carefully, her mind already working through the details of how they could make the necessary changes without causing too much disruption to the hotel's day-to-day operations. I think it's important that we start by addressing the leadership, Naomi said thoughtfully. If the people at the top aren't setting the right example, then it doesn't matter how much training we give the staff. The culture starts with them. Jonathan nodded in agreement. You're right, we'll need to make some tough decisions about who stays and who goes. I'm not going to tolerate anyone who thinks it's okay to treat our guests the way Richard treated you. Naomi appreciated his resolve, but she also knew there was a delicate balance to strike. Firing people outright might solve the immediate problem, but it wouldn't necessarily fix the deeper issue. There had to be room for growth and accountability, an opportunity for people to learn from their mistakes and do better. Maybe we should offer Richard and the others the chance to prove they can change, Naomi suggested. Put them through the training, give them clear expectations, and see how they respond. If they can't meet those standards, then we let them go, but we give them the opportunity to learn first. Jonathan considered her words carefully. That's fair, he said after a moment, but they'll need to show real progress. We're not giving second chances to people who aren't willing to change. Naomi nodded, feeling a sense of relief that they were on the same page. It was a long road ahead, but they were committed to walking it together. As they finished their meal, Naomi couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in just a few short hours. What had started as a simple dinner to celebrate Jonathan's new venture had turned into something far more profound. But despite the challenges they faced, Naomi felt a renewed sense of purpose. This hotel could be so much more than just another luxury destination. It could be a place where real change happened, and she was ready to help make that happen. The next morning, Naomi and Jonathan arrived at Regal Heights with a renewed sense of purpose. The atmosphere felt different today, not because of the hotel's opulence, but because they were both preparing to address the issue head-on. The night before had been filled with discussions about the changes they needed to make, and today they would begin setting those changes in motion. Jonathan led the way as they walked into the hotel, his expression serious and focused. Naomi walked beside him, her thoughts sharp and clear. They were about to confront the leadership team, and this wasn't just a casual conversation. It was about reshaping the culture of the hotel, setting new standards, and ensuring that every guest felt welcome and respected. Gregory, the senior manager, was already waiting in the lobby, his face tense with anticipation. He had spent the night preparing for this meeting, and though he was determined to show his support for the changes Jonathan had outlined, there was a nervousness in his demeanor that he couldn't quite shake. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins." "Mrs. Jenkins," Gregory greeted them, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. "I've gathered the department heads in the conference room, as you requested. We're ready to begin whenever you are." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you, Gregory," he said, his tone brisk but appreciative. "Let's get started." Naomi and Jonathan followed Gregory down the hall, the plush carpets of the hotel muffling their steps as they approached the conference room. Inside, the department heads were already seated, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Richard was among them, sitting stiffly at the far end of the table. He looked pale, his usual arrogance nowhere to be seen. It was clear that he understood the gravity of the situation. As they entered the room, all eyes turned toward Jonathan and Naomi. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Jonathan walked to the front of the room, standing tall and composed, while Naomi took a seat nearby, her gaze steady as she observed the reactions of the staff. "Thank you all for being here," Jonathan began, his voice firm but calm. "As many of you know, last night we encountered an issue that has forced us to reevaluate the way this hotel operates. What happened was unacceptable, and it has made us realize that there are deeper issues we need to address." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room remained silent, the department heads shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This hotel was built on the idea that we could provide a luxurious experience for every guest who walks through the door, Jonathan continued. But that experience means nothing if people are being treated unfairly based on their appearance, their background, or anything else that has no bearing on their right to be here. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form. Naomi watched the reactions around the room. Some of the department heads nodded in agreement, while others seemed more uncertain. Richard, in particular, kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "We're going to make some changes," Jonathan said, his voice resolute. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory bias training for all staff members. This training will focus on how to treat every guest with the respect and dignity they deserve, regardless of who they are. In addition, we'll be conducting a full review of the hotel's policies and procedures to ensure that our commitment to inclusivity is reflected in every aspect of how we do business." Gregory nodded in agreement, though his expression remained tense. He knew that these changes were necessary, but he also understood how disruptive they could be to the daily operations of the hotel. Still, he was determined to support Jonathan's vision. Jonathan glanced around the room, making eye contact with each of the department heads. "I understand that change can be difficult," he said, his tone softening slightly. "But this isn't just about making the hotel look good. It's about doing what's right. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome, where no one is made to feel like they don't belong." Naomi could feel the mood in the room shifting. The weight of Jonathan's words was beginning to resonate with the staff, even those who had seemed skeptical at first. Jonathan's gaze settled on Richard, who was still sitting silently at the end of the table. "Richard," Jonathan said, his voice steady but firm, "I want you to know that we're giving you an opportunity to learn from this. You'll be going through the same training as everyone else, and you'll be held to the same standards. But let me be clear, if you can't meet those standards, there won't be a place for you here." Richard finally looked up, his face tight with a mixture of shame and fear. "I understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Naomi watched him closely. She could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was still grappling with the idea that his behavior had been called into question, while another part of him seemed to understand that he had made a serious mistake. Jonathan turned his attention back to the rest of the room. "This is a fresh start for all of us," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to rebuild this hotel into something we can all be proud of. But that starts with each of you. It's up to us to make sure that every guest who walks through our doors is treated with the respect they deserve." The room remained silent, but there was a palpable sense of agreement in the air. The staff understood that the time for change had come, and there was no turning back. Naomi spoke up for the first time, her voice calm but full of purpose. "We believe in this hotel," she said, her eyes moving from face to face. "We believe in its potential to be more than just another luxury establishment. But we can't do it alone. We need all of you to be part of that change." As she finished speaking, there was a quiet moment of reflection in the room. The staff, though still apprehensive, seemed to be taking in the magnitude of what was being asked of them. Jonathan nodded once, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you all for your time," he said. "We'll be in touch with more details about the training and the new policies. Let's make this hotel something we can all be proud of." As the staff began to file out of the room, Naomi felt a sense of hope. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. As the meeting wrapped up and the staff slowly left the room, Naomi and Jonathan lingered for a moment, taking in the gravity of what had just happened. The change they had initiated felt real, but they both knew it was just the beginning. The cultural shift they were aiming for would take time, patience, and persistence. Naomi felt a mix of determination and caution. She was ready for the work ahead, but knew there would be resistance. Jonathan sighed softly, running a hand through his hair as he leaned against the edge of the conference table. "Well, that went about as expected," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. Naomi gave him a small smile. "It's a start. They're listening. That's more than we could have asked for a day ago." Jonathan nodded, though the tension in his shoulders remained. I just don't want it to be all talk. Change on paper is one thing, but real change, that's harder to achieve. Naomi stepped closer, placing a comforting hand on his arm. We'll get there, she said softly. We just have to keep pushing. We're doing the right thing. Just as they were about to leave the room, Gregory reappeared in the doorway, his face still tense from the meeting. Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Jenkins, he called out, walking briskly toward them. There's something I think you both need to know. Jonathan straightened, immediately alert. What is it, Gregory? Gregory hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering between them. I've been going over some of the guest reports from the past few months, and, well, there's a pattern. It's subtle, but I think it's worth looking into. Naomi frowned, stepping forward. What kind of pattern? Gregory shifted uncomfortably. There have been multiple complaints from guests, specifically guests of color, about being treated differently by the staff. Nothing outright. It is right, but enough that it's noticeable. It's always the same kind of issue. Slow service, rude behavior, rooms not being ready on time. Little things, but they add up. Jonathan's expression darkened as Gregory continued. I didn't think much of it at first, Gregory admitted. But after what happened last night, I decided to dig deeper. There's been a steady decline in returning guests, and the reviews from some of our most diverse clientele have been consistently negative. I think the issues go beyond Richard. Naomi's stomach sank as Gregory's words settled in. She had suspected there might be more to the problem, but hearing it confirmed made it feel even more urgent. Why didn't you bring this up earlier? Jonathan asked, his voice firm but not accusatory. Gregory rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. To be honest, sir, I didn't connect the dots until now. It's easy to write off complaints as isolated incidents, but when you see them all together, it paints a different picture. Naomi exchanged a glance with Jonathan, both of them understanding the magnitude of what Gregory was saying. This wasn't just a matter of one manager's bad behavior. The issues ran deeper, and they affected the very foundation of how the hotel operated. We're going to need a full report on this, Jonathan said, his tone decisive. I want to see every guest complaint, every review, and any incident that even remotely suggests discrimination or unfair treatment. Gregory nodded quickly. I'll have it ready by the end of the day. As Gregory left the room, Jonathan turned to Naomi, his jaw clenched. This is bigger than I thought, Yamio, he said quietly. We're not just dealing with a few bad apples. The whole tree is rotten. Naomi nodded, feeling the weight of his words. But we can still fix it. We just have to be thorough and relentless. Jonathan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. You're right, we've come too far to let this go unchecked. Naomi stepped closer, taking his hand in hers. We're in this together. We'll get through it. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently, his gaze softening. I know, I'm just glad I have you by my side. They stood there for a moment in silence, both of them fully aware of the challenge ahead. But there was strength in their partnership, and that gave them hope. Together, they would root out the problems, address the failures, and rebuild the hotel into something they could both be proud of. Later that day, Naomi and Jonathan sat together in their office, going over the reports Gregory had compiled. The stack of documents in front of them was thick, filled with guest complaints, reviews, and incident reports from the last several months. As they sifted through the papers, the pattern Gregory had mentioned became even more apparent. The complaints, though often subtle, revealed a troubling trend. Naomi scanned one of the reviews, her brow furrowing as she read. Here's another one, she said, handing the paper to Jonathan. A guest mentions feeling unwelcome by the staff during their stay. They said they were given the cold shoulder and that the service was noticeably slower when compared to other guests. Jonathan sighed, rubbing his temples. It's the same thing in almost every report, he said, his voice low with frustration. Disrespectful behavior, delays in service, and a clear sense that certain guests aren't treated the same as others. How did we not see this sooner? Naomi understood his frustration. They had both been so focused on the financial side of the business, on making the hotel was running smoothly from a business perspective, that they hadn't taken a closer look at how guests were being treated on a day-to-day basis. But now the truth was staring them in the face. This isn't just bad customer service, Naomi said, her voice steady but filled with concern. It's a systemic issue. There's an underlying bias here, and it's been allowed to fester for too long. Jonathan nodded in agreement. We have to get to the root of it. If we don't fix this, it's going to ruin the reputation of the hotel, not to mention it's completely unacceptable. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her mind racing as she thought about how to tackle the problem. We need to start with the leadership, she said, echoing a thought she'd had earlier. The department heads, the managers, they're the ones setting the tone for the rest of the staff. If they're not holding people accountable, nothing's going to change. Jonathan set down the report he'd been reading, looking at Naomi with a mixture of determination and weariness. You're right. We'll start with them, but I think we're going to need more than just training. We need to rebuild the culture from the ground up. Naomi considered his words, nodding slowly. We can't let this be a quick fix. If we're going to make real, lasting change, we need to overhaul how we approach everything, from hiring practices to guest interaction policies. It's going to take time, but it's the only way to ensure this doesn't happen again. Jonathan looked out the window for a moment, his gaze distant as he processed what needed to be done. We'll need to bring in outside consultants, people who specialize in diversity and inclusion. They can help us create a comprehensive plan, something that addresses every level of the hotel's operations. Naomi agreed, and we'll need to be transparent about it. The staff needs to know that this is serious, that we're committed to making things better. If we don't involve them in the process, they won't buy into the changes. Jonathan turned back to her, his expression resolute. I'll make the calls. We'll bring in the best people to help us, and we'll make sure the staff understands that this isn't just about saving face. It's about doing what's right. Naomi reached across the desk, taking Jonathan's hand. I know it feels overwhelming, she said softly, but we're doing the right thing. This is going to make a difference. Jonathan squeezed her hand gently, offering her a small, tired smile. I know, and having you by my side makes all the difference. And they sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. But despite the enormity of the task ahead, Naomi felt a sense of purpose. They were taking the necessary steps to address the problem, and that was the first step toward real change. Later that afternoon, Jonathan arranged a meeting with the department heads to inform them of the changes that would be coming. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Jonathan and Naomi made it clear that the days of overlooking biased behavior were over. This is not optional, Jonathan said firmly as he addressed the group. Every department head will be required to undergo training, and we'll be implementing new policies across the board to ensure that every guest is treated with the respect they deserve. If you can't get on board with these changes, there won't be a place for you here. The department heads, many of whom had been with the hotel for years, exchanged uneasy glances. Change was coming, and it was clear that it would affect everyone from the top down. Naomi could see the discomfort on their faces, but she knew this was necessary. We understand that this is a big shift, she said, her voice steady. But this is about more than just protecting the reputation of the hotel. It's about doing what's right and making sure that this hotel is a place where everyone feels welcome. One of the department heads, a man named Harold, who had worked at the hotel for decades, cleared his throat and spoke up. We've always prided ourselves on our high standards here, he said carefully. I'm not sure where things went wrong, but I'll admit, we might have become too comfortable. It's time for a wake-up call. Jonathan nodded, appreciating Harold's candor. Exactly. And this is that wake-up call. We're not here to blame anyone for the past, but we're here to make sure the future is better. The rest of the meeting proceeded with a sense of cautious optimism. Some of the department heads were more resistant to the changes than others, but it was clear that they understood the seriousness of the situation. As the meeting wrapped up, Naomi felt a sense of relief. The groundwork had been laid, but there was still much more to do. The road ahead would be long, but they were committed to seeing it through. As the department heads filed out of the meeting room, Naomi and Jonathan exchanged glances, their shared understanding evident without needing words. They had taken a significant step, but the weight of the journey still ahead pressed heavily on both of them. The cultural shift required to rebuild the trust and integrity of Regal Heights wasn't just about policies. It was about changing deeply ingrained attitudes. That kind of change wasn't easy, but they were both committed to seeing it through. Once the room was empty, Naomi sat down in one of the now vacant chairs, her thoughts swirling. You could see it in their eyes, she said softly, almost to herself. Some of them are scared of what this change means. It's going to be hard for them to let go of the way things have always been. Jonathan nodded, walking over to sit beside her. It's normal, he said, his voice steady. Change makes people uncomfortable, especially when it forces them to confront their own behaviors. But that's exactly why this is so important. We're asking them to look at themselves and admit they've been part of the problem. Naomi let out a long breath. It's not just about them, though. We have to get every staff member on board, or this whole thing is going to crumble. If we can't get the people working on the floor, the ones interacting with guests every day, to change, none of this will stick. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in his lap as he considered her words. You're right, he said, and that's why we need to involve them in this process from the beginning. We can't just hand down new policies from the top and expect things to magically get better. We need to listen to their concerns, give them the tools they need to succeed, and make sure they feel like they're part of something bigger. Naomi looked at him, admiration in her eyes. You always know how to keep a level head, she said with a small smile, even when things feel like they're falling apart. Jonathan chuckled softly, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Trust me, I'm feeling the pressure too. But we've been through tough times before, Naomi. We'll get through this one too. I know, Marcus, I know. For the rest of the afternoon, they sat together talking about the days ahead. Marcus filled Edith in on the legal strategy, explaining how they would approach the lawsuit and what they could expect in the coming weeks. Edith listened carefully, asking questions and offering her thoughts, but she never wavered in her support for her son's plan. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the living room windows, Marcus stood up and kissed his mother on the forehead. I'll be back tomorrow, he said. We'll keep moving forward. Edith nodded, watching him as he left. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had faith in her son. He had always been strong, always determined, and she knew that no matter what obstacles they faced, they would get through it together. As Marcus drove away from his mother's house, the weight of the situation settled over him once again. He knew this fight was bigger than just his mother's case. It was about holding an entire system accountable, and it wasn't going to be a quick or easy battle. But Marcus had never backed down from a fight before, and he wasn't about to start now. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and preparations. Alicia was working tirelessly on the legal side, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a rock-solid case against the officers and the department. Marcus, meanwhile, was focused on the media strategy. He knew that public pressure would be crucial in making sure the case got the attention it deserved. Finally, the day came when they were ready to take the first step. The lawsuit was filed, and the media received the official statement. The story broke within hours, and soon news outlets across the country were covering the case. Headlines screamed about the police brutality inflicted on a 73-year-old disabled black woman and the impending legal battle led by her son, a powerful CEO with deep ties in the tech world. As the news spread, so did the public outrage. Social media lit up with hashtags demanding justice for Edith, and protests began to form outside the precinct. The video footage that had been shared online became a rallying cry for people across the nation who were fed up with police brutality and systemic racism. Marcus watched the coverage closely, knowing that the tide was turning in their favor. The police department, once confident in their ability to weather the storm, was now facing intense scrutiny from all sides. The officers involved had been suspended pending the investigation, but Marcus knew that wasn't enough. He wanted criminal charges, and he wanted real systemic change. As the media continued to cover the story, Marcus received a call from the police chief. It was a call he had been expecting for days. Mr. Johnson, the chief said, his voice strained, we'd like to meet with you to discuss a possible resolution. Marcus smiled grimly, knowing exactly what that meant. The police department was feeling the pressure, and now they wanted to negotiate. But Marcus wasn't interested in a quiet settlement. He was fighting for something bigger. I'll meet with you, Marcus said, his voice calm. I want real accountability. I'm not walking out of that meeting unless we get commitments for real changes, reforms, criminal charges, the works. Alicia smiled slightly, appreciating his resolve. Good. We'll stick to the plan. You're in control here, Marcus. They need this to go away more than you do. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the task ahead, but he was ready. He had always been ready to fight for what was right, and this time was no different. His mother's strength and resilience had been an example to him throughout his life, and now more than ever, he would make sure her suffering wouldn't be in vain. The meeting was set for later that afternoon at the police headquarters. Marcus arrived with Alicia by his side, and as they walked through the large glass doors, they were met with curious glances from officers and staff. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew why they were there, and everyone knew what was at stake. They were led into a large conference room where the police chief, 2 senior officers, and a few legal representatives from the department were waiting. The chief, an older man with graying hair and a stiff posture, stood as Marcus entered. Mr. Johnson, thank you for coming, the chief said, extending a hand. Marcus ignored the gesture, his expression cold. Let's get to the point. The chief cleared his throat awkwardly and gestured for everyone to sit. As they all took their seats around the table, the chief opened a folder in front of him, clearly trying to appear calm and composed, though Marcus could see the strain behind his eyes. We want to resolve this situation quickly and fairly, the chief began, glancing at his legal team for support. What happened to your mother was unfortunate, and we're prepared to offer compensation for her injuries, as well as a public apology from the department. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming. A shallow attempt to sweep the incident under the rug with a check and a few words of regret. But that wasn't nearly enough. "And the officers?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but sharp. "They have been suspended," the chief said carefully, "pending the outcome of an internal investigation, but we believe this can be resolved without dragging the department through a lengthy legal process." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on the chief. "Suspended?" he repeated. "That's all? They assaulted my mother, a 73-year-old disabled woman. You think suspending them is justice?" The chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but before he could respond, Alicia stepped in. "What we're looking for is more than a slap on the wrist," Alicia said, her voice firm and measured. "We want criminal charges brought against both officers for excessive use of force and assault. We also want a commitment to reforms within the department, specifically regarding racial bias in the treatment of elderly and disabled individuals." The chief's face tightened. He hadn't expected them to push for such a strong response. "Criminal charges?" he asked, glancing nervously at his legal team. "That might be difficult. The officers claim they were following protocol." "Following protocol," Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "Since when is beating an elderly woman part of your protocol?" The tension in the room spiked as Marcus's words hung in the air. "Is a place where everyone feels welcome." One of the department heads, a man named Harold, who had worked at the hotel for decades, cleared his throat, and the chief's legal representatives exchanged worried glances, clearly realizing that this negotiation wasn't going to be as simple as they had hoped. "We're not here to make this easy for you," Alicia continued, her tone ice cold. "The Johnson family isn't interested in a quick payout to make this go away. This is about real accountability. If you're not willing to discuss that, then we'll see you in court, and we'll make sure the media stays fully engaged every step of the way." The chief leaned back in his chair, clearly realizing that the situation was slipping out of his control. He knew the case had already garnered significant public attention, and the last thing the department wanted was a drawn-out, highly publicized trial. The pressure was mounting, and they didn't have much room to maneuver. "Let's be reasonable," one of the department's lawyers chimed in, trying to take control of the conversation. "This isn't about avoiding responsibility, but we have to be realistic. Criminal charges could be difficult to prove in this case, given the officers' claims. We're willing to negotiate on the reforms, but the charges, that's a separate issue." Marcus clenched his fists under the table, his frustration mounting. He could see what they were trying to do, offering small concessions in exchange for leaving the officers untouched. But Marcus wasn't about to let them off the hook. "You think we'll settle for that?" Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. "You think you can let those officers walk away without facing any real consequences? You don't know who you're dealing with." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words settling heavily on everyone present. Alicia, sensing the shift in the room, leaned forward. "We're not going to back down," Alicia said firmly. "The longer this drags out, the worse it gets for you. The media is already watching closely, and every day that passes, the pressure on your department grows. We want a full investigation, criminal charges, and immediate reforms. That's our bottom line." The chief looked down at the papers in front of him, clearly struggling with how to proceed. He knew they were in a losing position, but admitting that would mean undermining the entire department. It was a delicate balance, one he didn't seem prepared to handle. After a long pause, the chief finally spoke, his voice strained. "We'll consider your demands, but we need time to discuss this with the district attorney's office." Marcus stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back from the table. "You've had enough time," he said coldly. "We'll give you 24 hours. After that, we go public with everything. The choice is yours." Without waiting for a response, Marcus turned and walked out of the room, Alicia following closely behind. The sound of the door closing behind them echoed through the hallway as they left the police headquarters. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, Marcus felt a sense of relief. "They're calling a press conference. This might be it." Edith nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and caution. "Be careful, Marcus." "I will," he promised. He stood up, leaning down to kiss her on the forehead. "I'll be back soon." As Marcus left the house, his heart pounded with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment when the police department would have to face the public and hopefully take responsibility for their actions. When Marcus arrived at the location, a crowd had already gathered in front of the police headquarters. Reporters, camera crews, and community members filled the space. the buzz of anticipation growing as everyone waited for the chief to speak. Alicia was standing near the front, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Marcus. "Over here," she called, waving him over. Marcus made his way through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the podium that had been set up in front of the precinct. "Do you think they'll give in?" Marcus asked as he reached Alicia. "They have to," Alicia replied. "There's too much pressure. If they don't, it's going to get ugly for them." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. He wasn't going to get his hopes up just yet. He knew how these things had worked, how often the system protected its own. But he also knew that they had the upper hand. The media was here, the public was watching, and the police department had no choice but to respond. After a few minutes, the chief stepped up to the podium, the crowd falling silent as he began to speak. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for some sign of approval. "Good afternoon," the chief began, his voice amplified by the microphone. "We are here today to address the incident involving Ms. Edith Johnson, which has raised serious concerns in our community. First, let me say that we deeply regret the events that occurred and the harm that was caused to Ms. Johnson. No one should have to endure what she went through." The chief paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Effective immediately, the officers involved in the incident have been placed on administrative leave, and we are conducting a thorough investigation into their actions. Additionally, we are working with community leaders to implement new training protocols to address issues of racial bias in the treatment of elderly and disabled individuals." Marcus listened, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was a good start, but it wasn't enough. He wanted to hear about real accountability, criminal charges, not just administrative leave. The chief hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Furthermore, we have reached out to Ms. Johnson's family to discuss a fair resolution to this matter, including compensation for her injuries. We understand that this incident has shaken the trust between our department and the community, and we are committed to rebuilding that trust through transparency and accountability." A murmur went through the crowd, reporters scribbling notes and cameras flashing as the chief spoke. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes fixed on the chief's face. He could see the strain there, the realization that this was bigger than just one incident, that it was about the entire system and the way it treated people like his mother. After the chief finished speaking, he stepped away from the podium, and the crowd erupted in questions. Reporters shouted over each other, trying to get his attention, but the chief simply nodded to his aides and began walking back toward. "It's a start, but we need more. Administrative leave is nothing. They need to be held criminally accountable. And those training protocols? We need specifics." Marcus nodded, his eyes still on the chief as he disappeared into the building. "I'm not letting this go. They think they can make this go away with a press conference. But we're not done." "Not by a long shot," Alicia agreed. "We'll keep pushing. We've got the public on our side now. Yeah, now, and we're not letting up." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus felt a mix of emotions, relief that the department was finally addressing what had happened, but also frustration that it still wasn't enough. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to see this through to the end. Later that afternoon, Marcus returned to his mother's house, feeling a sense of exhaustion settle over him. He had been running on adrenaline for days. But now that the initial shock had worn off, the emotional toll was beginning to weigh on him. Edith was sitting in her chair, her eyes lighting up as Marcus walked in. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and concern. "They called a press conference," Marcus said, sitting down beside her. "They put the officers on leave and promised to investigate. They also mentioned new training protocols." Edith listened, her face thoughtful. "That's something at least," she said quietly. "But it's not enough, is it?" "No, Marcus said, shaking his head. "It's not. We're going to keep pushing. We need criminal charges, real accountability, and we need changes that go beyond just a few new policies." Edith reached out and took his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done so much already, Marcus. You've given me a voice when I didn't have one, and you're giving a voice to so many others who need it." Marcus squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm not stopping, Mom. Not until we get the justice you deserve." "I know," Edith said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." As the sun set outside the window, casting a warm glow over the room, Marcus and Edith sat together, their hands intertwined. They knew the road ahead would be long and there would be more battles to fight. But they also knew that they were not alone. The community was behind them, the world was watching, and they had each other. And that was enough to keep going. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The press conference had drawn significant attention, and the story of Edith Johnson's brutal treatment at the hands of police officers had now become a focal point of national conversation. News networks ran segments dissecting the incident, while social media continued to erupt in outrage, with people demanding accountability. The community around Marcus and Edith had come together, organizing rallies and protests, calling for justice, not only for Edith, but for all victims of police brutality. Despite the chief's statement, Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. They had made promises, but now it was up to Marcus, Alicia, and their team to make sure those promises were fulfilled, and that they went beyond mere words. The pressure had to stay on, and that meant keeping the public engaged and ensuring the authorities felt the weight of every misstep. Alicia worked tirelessly, filing motions and pushing the district attorney's office to open a criminal investigation against the officers involved. She was relentless in her pursuit, and Marcus was right there beside her, making sure no stone was left unturned. They met daily, planning strategies and discussing their next moves. They knew the police department would try to drag this out, hoping that public attention would eventually fade. But Marcus was determined to keep the spotlight firmly on them. One morning, as Marcus and Alicia were reviewing documents at her office, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, with an attachment labeled urgent. Marcus frowned, showing the message to Alicia. She looked at the screen, her brow furrowing. "Who's it from?" "No idea," Marcus said, opening the message. It was a video file, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he watched it load. The video began playing, and Marcus's eyes widened. It was body cam footage. Raw, unedited footage from one of the officers involved in his mother's arrest. The timestamp showed that it was from the day of the incident. The video depicted the officers approaching Edith, their voices filled with aggression from the start. The sneers, the threats, the unnecessary violence. It was all there, clear as day. The footage showed them slapping her, grabbing her roughly, and dragging her to the squad car. Marcus's hands trembled as he watched, his jaw clenching. This was it, the proof they needed. Everything that had happened, every cruel word, every brutal action was documented in the footage. The officers' claims that Edith had resisted were clearly false, their abuse and racial bias undeniable. "Who sent this?" Alicia asked, leaning over Marcus's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I don't know," Marcus replied, his voice shaking slightly. "But it changes everything. This is the evidence." Marcus could see the shock and anger in their faces. The realization that the police department had lied. When the video ended, Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd. "This is what happened to my mother. This is the reality of police brutality that so many people face every day. And this is why we are demanding accountability. We will not rest until those responsible are brought to justice. Not just for my mother, but for every victim of police violence." The crowd erupted in questions, reporters shouting over each other as they tried to get Marcus's attention. Alicia stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We are calling for the immediate arrest of the officers involved, as well as a full investigation into the department's practices. This is not just about one incident, this is about systemic change." The press conference made headlines across the country, the video footage sparking outrage and renewed calls for reform. The public pressure was now insurmountable, and the district attorney had no choice but to open a criminal investigation. The officers involved were arrested, charged with assault and misconduct, and the police department faced intense scrutiny as investigators began digging into their practices and policies. For Marcus, it was a moment of vindication, but it was also just the beginning. He knew that real change would take time, and that this fight was far from over. But for now, he had taken a crucial step forward, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was fully served. Back at home, Edith watched the news coverage of the press conference, her eyes filling with tears as she saw her son standing at the podium, his voice strong and unwavering. She had always known Marcus was capable of great things, but seeing him fight for her, seeing the impact he was making, filled her with a sense of pride that words could never fully capture. When Marcus returned home that evening, Edith was waiting for him, her face softening as she saw him walk through the door. "You did it," she said, her voice trembling. "You made them listen." Marcus smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "We're not done yet, Mom, but we're getting there." Edith nodded, her heart swelling with love for her son. "I always knew you were meant for something great, Marcus. And now the world knows it too." They sat together, the weight of the day slowly lifting as they found comfort in each other's presence. Marcus knew there were still battles ahead, court hearings, reform efforts, and the long road to healing. But he also knew that they were on the right path, and that they had the strength to see it through. As the night drew on, Edith leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace washing over her. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that with Marcus by her side, the day of the interview arrived, and as Marcus stood in front of the camera, he felt a surge of determination. The interviewer began with standard questions about the case, and Marcus answered confidently, his passion evident in every word. But as the conversation progressed, he made sure to shift the focus toward the broader issues at play. "This is not just about my mother's story," he said firmly, leaning slightly toward the camera. "It's about the countless individuals who have faced similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement. It's about the systemic racism that permeates our justice system. And it's time for us to demand accountability and reform." The interviewer nodded, clearly engaged by his words. "What specific changes do you believe are necessary to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing this was his chance to lay out a clear vision for change. "We need comprehensive training for police officers on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. We need independent oversight of police departments to ensure accountability. And we need to establish clearer policies on the treatment of vulnerable populations, including the elderly and disabled." As he spoke, Marcus felt the energy in the room shift. This was more than just an interview. It was an opportunity to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. He was determined to ensure that this conversation didn't end with him, that it continued to spread, reaching far beyond the local community. After the interview concluded, Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done what he set out to do. He had brought attention to the issue, and he had used his platform to advocate for real change. As he left the studio, his phone buzzed with the messages from supporters and friends, praising him for his articulate and passionate defense of justice. Marcus smiled, feeling a renewed sense of hope. Back at home, he found Edith sitting in her favorite chair, a warm smile on her face as she watched the news. Marcus joined her, the two of them sharing a quiet moment together, reflecting on how far they had come since that day at the precinct. "You were incredible," Edith said, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Marcus. You're making a difference." "I couldn't do it without you, Mom," Marcus replied, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You inspire me every day." But as they sat together, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The police department might be under pressure now, but they had deep roots and a strong desire to protect their own. He knew that they would push back hard against the reforms he was advocating for. A few days later, Marcus received an unexpected call from Captain Ellis. The chief had requested a meeting with him to discuss potential reforms and how to move forward. Marcus was taken aback. Had they finally realized that changes? Like what? Administrative leave for the officers involved? That's not enough. "Of course," Ellis replied quickly. "We're looking at training programs, community engagement initiatives, and establishing an oversight committee to monitor our practices. We want to rebuild trust with the community, and we know that starts with accountability." Marcus studied the captain's face, trying to gauge whether he was being sincere. "And what about the officers involved in my mother's case? Will they face criminal charges?" Ellis shifted slightly, his expression faltering. "That's more complicated. We're conducting an internal investigation, but criminal charges would require a different process. We need to ensure that we have a solid case before moving forward." Marcus felt frustration boiling within him. What does that even mean? You can't let them off the hook because of red tape. This is about justice. "I understand that," Ellis said, his voice steady, "but we have to work within the system. I'm trying to navigate this carefully." "You're trying to protect your own," Marcus shot back, his voice sharp. "You're afraid of the fallout. But this isn't about you or your department. This is about my mother, about justice." The captain's jaw tightened, and for a moment the tension between them hung heavy in the air. Marcus could feel the weight of their differences, the unyielding system that had failed his mother, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice that drove him forward. "Look," Ellis said finally, his voice calmer, "we want to work together, but it has to be a mutual effort. If we're going to make real change, we need your support too. We need your input on the reforms, on how we can better serve the community." Marcus considered this for a moment, weighing the captain's words. He knew that change couldn't come solely from outside the department. It needed to come from within as well. But that didn't mean he would accept anything less than accountability for what had happened to his mother. "I'll consider it," Marcus replied, his tone cool. "But know this, I'm not going to stop fighting for justice. Not for my mother and not for anyone else who has faced this kind of brutality." Captain Ellis nodded, understanding the gravity of Marcus's words. They both knew that the road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and pushback. But they also knew that real change was possible if they worked together. As Marcus left the precinct, he felt a mix of emotions swirling within him: frustration, determination, and a renewed sense of purpose. He knew they were on the brink of something significant, and he was ready to do whatever it took to ensure justice was served. That evening, Marcus returned home, ready to share the day's developments with his mother. Edith nodded, a proud smile spreading across her face. I knew you would stand your ground. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. This fight isn't just about us anymore, Mom. It's about making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to anyone else. We're going to push for real change. As they talked about the meeting and the next steps in the fight, Marcus could feel the weight of their struggles slowly lifting. They were in this together, and with each passing day, they were getting closer to justice. The days following the meeting with Captain Ellis were a flurry of activity. The press coverage of Edith's case continued to gain momentum, with articles being published across various media platforms. Public demonstrations were organized, and people rallied together, demanding justice and reform. Marcus and Alicia worked tirelessly to keep the pressure on the police department, and they were gaining allies in their fight. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from a civil rights organization that wanted to collaborate with them on the case. They were impressed by the outcry surrounding Edith's situation and offered their support in advocating for broader reforms. Marcus agreed to meet with them, recognizing that the more voices they had on their side, the stronger their message would be. When the day of the meeting arrived, Marcus found himself in a large conference room filled with representatives from the organization. They were a diverse group, passionate about justice and reform, and their energy was contagious. As they discussed strategies for moving forward, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. We need to make sure that the public knows this isn't just an isolated incident, one of the representatives said, her voice filled with conviction. We need to expose the systemic issues that allow this kind of behavior to thrive within police departments. I completely agree, Marcus said, leaning forward in his chair. This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that officers understand that they are not above the law. We want to push for real changes that protect our communities. As the meeting continued, they brainstormed ways to amplify their message. Social media campaigns, public demonstrations, and partnerships with other organizations were all on the table. The group was determined to keep the spotlight on the police department, ensuring that they couldn't hide from the consequences of their actions. After the meeting, Marcus felt invigorated. He knew that this was only the beginning, but having the support of a larger community made the fight feel more achievable. He also realized that this wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about everyone who had faced injustice and discrimination. That evening, Marcus returned home, eager to share the news with Edith. He found her in the living room, sitting in her favorite chair, surrounded by the remnants of her knitting supplies. "Mom," he called as he walked in, "I have some exciting news." Edith looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "What is it?" "I just met with a civil rights organization that wants to partner with us," Marcus said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. "They're going to help amplify our message and push for broader reforms." Edith's eyes widened with delight. "That's wonderful, Marcus. The more support we have, the better chance we have of making real change." "It is," Marcus agreed, his heart swelling with pride. "This isn't just about us anymore, Mom. It's about all the people who have faced what you did, and making sure it never happens again." Edith's smile faded slightly, her expression becoming more serious. "Just be careful, Marcus." "I will, Mom," he promised, taking her hands in his. "I'm focused on justice for you and for everyone else. We're going to see this through together." As they sat together discussing the plans for the coming weeks, Marcus felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he also knew that they were on the right path. With each step, they were getting closer to justice, and Marcus was determined to ensure that the truth was heard. The following days were a whirlwind of activity as the Civil Rights Organization worked with Marcus and Alicia to coordinate their efforts. Social media campaigns were launched, showcasing Edith's story and highlighting the need for reform. Videos of the press conference circulated widely, and soon the hashtags had Justice for Edith and #End Police Brutality were trending. Marcus couldn't believe the amount of support pouring in. He received messages from people all over the country sharing their own stories of injustice, many of them expressing their gratitude for bringing attention to these issues. It was a powerful reminder that they were not alone in this fight. But as the public pressure grew, so did the pushback from the police department. The police chief issued a statement defending the actions of the officers involved, claiming they had acted within their rights and suggesting that the community was overreacting. Marcus watched as the statement sparked outrage, with many citizens taking to social media to voice their dissent. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and Marcus knew they had to stay focused. He called a meeting with Alicia and the Civil Rights Organization to discuss their next steps. "We need to respond to the chief's statement," Marcus said, leaning over the table as they gathered in Alicia's office. "He's trying to spin this narrative in their favor, and we can't let that happen. Alicia nodded in agreement. We need to issue a statement that highlights the facts, what really happened, and the evidence we have to support it. We can't let them manipulate the story. We should also organize a rally, one of the representatives suggested. Something big to show the community's solidarity. We need to remind people that this is about more than just one incident. That's a great idea, Marcus said, feeling the excitement building in the room. Let's plan a rally for next week. We'll invite speakers, community leaders, and we'll make sure the media knows about it. As they worked through the details, Marcus felt the sense of unity among them. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about bringing together a community and amplifying the voices that had been silenced for too long. As the days passed, the rally was organized, drawing people from all walks of life. Marcus could feel the energy in the air as they prepared for the event. He knew this was an opportunity to rally support, to keep the pressure on the police department, and to show that the fight for justice was far from over. On the day of the rally, Marcus stood on stage, looking out at the sea of faces that had gathered in solidarity. The crowd was filled with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Edith" and "End Police Brutality." It was a powerful sight, a testament to the strength of community action. As the speeches began, "Together, we will ensure that what happened to my mother does not happen to anyone else. We will not back down. We will hold those in power accountable, and we will keep fighting until we achieve the change we need." The crowd erupted once again, their cheers echoing in the air, a chorus of voices united in a singular purpose. As Marcus stepped down from the stage, he felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. They were in this together, and together they would make a difference. The rally had ignited a fire within the community, bringing people together in a way Marcus had never seen before. The energy in the air was electric, a palpable sense of unity and purpose that resonated throughout the crowd. After the speeches concluded, people began to mingle, sharing their stories, connecting with one another, and solidifying their commitment to the fight for justice. Marcus spent the rest of the day speaking with attendees, answering questions, and discussing their plans for future actions. He was struck by the variety of experiences people shared, each one a testament to the systemic issues that plagued their community. Stories of racial profiling, police brutality, and unjust treatment at the hands of law enforcement flooded in, each one adding to the urgency of their cause. One woman approached Marcus, her voice trembling as she shared her own experience. "My brother was shot by police 2 years ago for no reason," she said, tears in her eyes. "We still haven't seen justice. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. It was stories like hers that fueled his determination. He knew that their fight was far from over, but he also felt a deep sense of purpose. They were not alone in this. Together, they could create real change. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the gathering, Marcus and Alicia regrouped to discuss their next steps. The rally had generated significant media coverage, and now they needed to maintain that momentum. They planned to follow up with press releases, continue engaging with the community, and organize additional events to keep the spotlight on their cause. "We need to keep the pressure on the police department," Alicia said as they sat down at a local cafe, discussing strategies over coffee. "They're feeling the heat, but they won't change without continued scrutiny. We should consider a follow-up event, perhaps a town hall meeting to discuss community concerns and police reform directly." Community members called for the implementation of body cameras for all officers, independent oversight of police practices, and regular community forums to foster open communication between the police department and the community. Marcus listened intently, taking notes and engaging with the audience. He encouraged them to stay vocal and to hold the police accountable at every opportunity. Together, they were laying the groundwork for real change. The meeting concluded with a renewed sense of purpose. As people filed out of the community center, there was a palpable energy in the air, a sense that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Marcus felt proud to stand alongside them, knowing that their collective action could lead to meaningful change. As he drove home that night, Marcus reflected on the progress they had made. They were still fighting for justice for his mother, but they were also fighting for everyone who had been victimized by the system. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but with the support of the community behind them, he felt more empowered than ever. When he arrived at home, Edith was waiting for him, her face lighting up as he walked in. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "It was incredible, Mom," Marcus replied, his excitement bubbling over. "The community came together like never before. People shared their stories, and we talked about real reform. It's a movement now." Edith smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew you could do it, Marcus. You're making a difference." We all are, he said, taking her hands in his. This isn't just about us anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's faced this kind of injustice, and together, we're going to make sure their voices are heard. As they sat together, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They were on the right path, and he was determined to see it through. The fight for justice was only beginning, but with each step they took, they were bringing light to the darkness that had long overshadowed their community. The days turned into weeks, and the momentum from the town hall meeting continued to build. Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope as the community rallied behind their cause, sharing stories and advocating for change. It was clear that they were no longer fighting alone. They had become part of a larger movement for justice. Alicia worked tirelessly to keep the pressure on the police department, pushing for accountability and transparency. They organized follow-up meetings with community leaders, ensuring that everyone remained engaged in the fight for reform. The district attorney, Alicia nodded, her expression serious. We need to mobilize our supporters and ensure that the public narrative stays focused on the facts. What really happened to your mother? Exactly, Marcus agreed. We need to utilize every platform available to us. Social media, press releases, community forums. We have to keep the conversation going and ensure that everyone knows the truth. The group began brainstorming strategies, discussing how they could counter the police department's narrative effectively. They planned to release their own statements, highlighting the evidence in the testimonies from witnesses. Marcus also suggested reaching out to sympathetic journalists who had covered the rally and the press conference, hoping they would be willing to tell the story from their perspective. As they developed their strategy, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were in this together, and together they would fight to ensure that justice was served. He knew that the battle ahead would be tough, but he also knew that they had the community behind them, and that made all the difference. The next day, as the news broke about the police department's PR campaign, Marcus and Alicia wasted no time in responding. They issued a detailed statement outlining the evidence they had gathered, including the video footage that had been released. They highlighted the officers' misconduct and emphasized the need for systemic change within the department. The public response was swift. Supporters rallied around the statement, amplifying it across social media and encouraging others to share it. News outlets picked up the story, furthering their reach. The police department's attempts to control the narrative began to crumble under the weight of the truth. As the days went by, Marcus continued to monitor the situation closely. The police chief held a press conference, attempting to defend the officers' actions, but the backlash was palpable. Public sentiment had shifted, and people were no longer willing to accept excuses. During this time, Marcus made it a point to check in on Edith regularly. She had been a pillar of strength throughout this ordeal, but he could see the toll it was taking on her. The stress of the situation weighed heavily on her, and Marcus wanted to ensure she felt supported. One evening, he arrived at her house with dinner, finding her sitting quietly in her favorite chair, her hands resting in her lap. "Hey, Mom," he said softly, setting the food on the table. "How are you feeling?" Edith looked up, a small smile breaking through her worried expression. "I'm okay, just tired," she admitted, "but I'm proud of everything you're doing, Marcus." "I appreciate that, but I want you to know it's okay to take a step back if you need to." "I don't want you to feel overwhelmed," he replied. Concern etched on his face. "I know, but this is important," Edith said, her voice steady. "It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone who has suffered. They're charging the officers," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. "That's fantastic," Alicia exclaimed. "This is a huge step forward. It shows that the district attorney is taking this seriously." "Yes, but we can't let up now," Marcus replied. "We need to keep pushing for broader reforms to ensure this doesn't happen again." As they prepared to announce the charges, Marcus knew that this was a pivotal moment in their fight for justice. They had made significant progress, but he also understood that this was just one battle in a much larger war. He was ready to continue the fight, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been wronged. As the news of the charges against the officers involved in Edith's assault broke, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and determination. This was a crucial step toward justice, but it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. He knew they still had to navigate the legal system and ensure that the officers faced real consequences for their actions. In the days that followed, Marcus and Alicia ramped up their efforts. They organized a press conference to announce the charges, inviting community leaders, activists, and members of the media to attend. This was an opportunity not just to celebrate the progress they had made, but to remind everyone that the fight was far from over. On the day of the press conference, the atmosphere was electric. The community center was filled with supporters, many of whom had rallied behind Edith's cause since the beginning. As Marcus took the stage, he could feel the weight of their collective hopes resting on his shoulders. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "Today marks a significant moment in our fight for justice. The district attorney's office has filed charges against the officers who assaulted my mother, Edith Johnson, and we are here to celebrate this progress while acknowledging that our work is far from finished." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound filling the room with energy. Marcus took a deep breath, steeling himself for the words to come. "But let us be clear, these charges are not just about my mother. They are about the countless individuals who have faced injustice at the hands of law enforcement. This is about demanding accountability and reform within the system." He continued, outlining the steps they were advocating for: comprehensive training for officers, independent oversight of police practices, and community engagement initiatives. Marcus emphasized that this was not just a moment to celebrate, but a call to action. "We cannot stop here," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "We must continue to push for change until every member of our community feels safe and respected. We will not rest until justice is served, not just for my mother, but for everyone who has suffered from the injustices of systemic racism and police brutality." As he finished, "That's all we can ask. Thank you for sharing your experience with us, and we'll do everything we can to make it right." As the guests left, Jonathan turned to Naomi, frustration etched on his face. "How did this happen? We've been working so hard to change things." Naomi placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We knew it wouldn't be easy, Jonathan. Change takes time, and there are going to be setbacks. The important thing is that we address these issues head-on and learn from them." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wish it didn't feel like we're constantly fighting an uphill battle." "We're not fighting alone," Naomi reminded him. "We're building a foundation for lasting change. Each of these challenges is an opportunity for us to grow stronger." With that, they regrouped with Gregory and discussed the next steps. They would conduct a thorough investigation into the complaint and hold follow-up meetings with the staff to reinforce their commitment to inclusivity and respect. Over the next few days, Jonathan and Naomi poured themselves into the work ahead. They reached out to the guests to discuss their experiences in more detail, ensuring they felt heard and valued. Meanwhile, they reinforced the importance of accountability during staff meetings, emphasizing that every employee played a role in creating a welcoming atmosphere. As they moved forward, they could feel the resistance beginning to dissipate. Some employees who had initially been skeptical began to engage more actively in discussions and training sessions, and a sense of camaraderie was starting to build among the staff. However, just as things began to settle, another challenge emerged. The hotel received a negative review from a prominent travel website, highlighting the previous guest's experience and suggesting that Regal Heights was not living up to its promises of inclusivity and exceptional service. Jonathan and Naomi gathered the management team to address the review, their expressions serious. "This is a wake-up call," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "We need to do everything we can to turn this around. We can't let one negative experience define us." Naomi nodded, her gaze steady. "Let's respond to the review publicly, acknowledging the issue and detailing the steps we're taking to address it. Transparency is key." The team agreed, and as they worked on crafting their response, Jonathan and Naomi felt a renewed sense of determination. They were committed to making Regal Heights a beacon of inclusivity and respect, and they would not let setbacks deter them from that mission. The journey was far from over, but with each challenge they faced, they grew stronger. Together, they would build a legacy that honored the values they held dear, ensuring that Regal Heights became a place where everyone felt welcome.